So I moved from the UK to Australia when I was 21, and in today's video we're going to go into 10 things that I wish I knew when I moved to Australia, because I was only 21 when I moved and I'd never had any experience of living abroad. I'd never been to Australia before, and to be honest I hadn't really done a lot of research, so there was quite a lot of things which, if I'd known beforehand, it could have stopped a lot of unnecessary issues and just led to me having a lot more of a stress-free time in Australia. Don't get me wrong, my whole time in Australia was amazing, I loved it, but you know, avoiding these things or having known these things before I went, I could have had an even better time. We'll come on to that in today's video. So before we get into it, make sure you give the video a like, subscribe to the channel as well, and yeah, let's get into 10 things that I wish I knew before moving to Australia. Number one is that jobs and houses are pretty hard to find. Now I knew that I'd had experience of finding jobs and stuff in the UK quite a bit, so I was kind of prepared in that sense, but when you go into Australia, you go into the big cities, there is so much competition when it comes to jobs. Same with houses. I'd never rented before, ever, before I moved to Australia, so it was a whole new experience for me, and it was definitely a challenge. Living in Sydney, it was definitely a challenge at the start, finding houses. I can't remember how easy I thought it was going to be, but it would have been worth knowing before that finding jobs and houses can take quite a while. We were in Sydney for quite a few weeks when we first got to Australia before we were set up with a job and a house. It definitely took us a good amount of time. I feel like a lot of people, they expect to get to Australia and be set up with both within the first week or two, and then when they don't, they're pretty stressed out. I think it's handy to know, and it would have been handy for me to know, that just be patient in that initial stage, because it does take a while to get set up with a job and a house, and we were fine after a while when we got set up, but maybe I did wish that I knew before that, you know, it is quite difficult and it does take a lot of patience, particularly with the houses, because I'd had no experience with that at all. But yeah, you get pretty used to that when you move, finding houses all the time, and after a while it just becomes normal. Number two is that the sun is no joke. Honestly, I'd heard that the sun was strong in Australia, but I don't think you realise how strong it is until you actually go there. In the UK, you can spend a lot of time outside and not really get that burnt at all. In Australia, even on a cloudy day, you can get very burnt through the clouds. I think there's meant to be like a hole in the ozone layer or something, so that's why the sun is so strong in Australia, but all the sun cream is like factor 50 plus. It's worth knowing before you go to Australia, because yeah, you're in for a pretty nasty surprise if you forget to wear sun cream out in Australia. It's definitely not like the UK sun. Going down the beach in Australia, you have to wear sun cream, otherwise yeah, you're going to be very red, especially if you come from the UK where you probably haven't seen the sun for a while. Number three is that everything closes pretty early. I didn't really expect this, to be honest, before moving to Australia, but first of all, the nightlife isn't anywhere near as good in Australia, but also the shops and everything, even in the city, close pretty early. In the UK, everything is open much later, and it definitely took me by surprise moving to Australia that I'd be going out at like 8-9 o'clock. I was a bit younger, so we were going out a lot more, and I was surprised to see that most things were shut a lot earlier than they would be in the UK. Number four is that wildlife is not as scary or as dangerous. Well, not as dangerous, but it's definitely not as scary as you expect it to be. When I first moved to Australia, I was checking the toilet seat, I was checking behind everywhere, under my bed sheets, but realistically, after a while, I stopped being paranoid, because I realised there is hardly any bugs. There was honestly more spiders in the UK. So if I knew that before I moved to Australia, it definitely would have saved me a lot of time and a lot of stress searching the house for bugs, because there is hardly any. I used to check the toilet seat every time, but like realistically, you just get used to not checking, and after a while it's fine. Number five is that the best places are the hidden gems and not the typical backpacker places. Now in Australia, I expected that my favourite places would be Sydney and all these, the Gold Coast, all these typical tourist places. I thought they would be my favourite places, but after spending a lot of time in Australia and traveling most of the country, most of my favourite places weren't the typical tourist places. My favourite cities were Adelaide and Perth, some little hidden gems. Darwin was amazing. Like, some of my favourite places were places which a lot of tourists and travellers miss out on. And I think I wish I knew this before moving, because I spent a lot of time initially in them touristy places, but it wasn't until I travelled more of the country and got to see some more remote places where I realised there's a lot nicer places in Australia that aren't just your typical like tourist places. Number 6, I wish I knew about using the correct transport in the right places. For example, like, every city has its good transport. In Sydney there's really good trains and buses, and during that initial period, I think maybe not being used to the new transport system and stuff, we just got lazy and just got Ubers everywhere, and even got a taxi when we first arrived and spent like ridiculous money on that. And out of convenience, we'd get a lot of Ubers, and sometimes, you know, we'd get buses to certain places when we could have got a train in like half the time. It's worth doing research sometimes on the transport system and stuff, and like most places in Australia, I feel like Australian cities have pretty good transport and you can get about pretty easily. And yeah, we definitely would have saved some money not getting like Ubers in that first couple of weeks for sure. Number 7 is that winter in Australia is way colder than I expected. I moved to Australia with my best mate initially, and he turned up with this big puffer jacket, and I was thinking, you are not going to need that, we are moving to Australia. But honestly, it was the best decision for him to bring that, because Australian winter is so much colder than I expected. Honestly, being in the house in Sydney in the winter, it was literally colder in the house than it was outside. I was absolutely freezing. And because I wasn't prepared for this, I didn't really have that many warm clothes. I didn't really have a coat. I had like a body warmer, but I was so cold during the winters in Australia, and yeah, I definitely didn't expect that. Number 8, I wish I knew about traveling first rather than staying in one place. For example, I stayed in Sydney for the first four and a half months of my time in Australia, which was quite a while, and that was all I really had my mind set on. And this could have been quite dangerous because we all that we pictured was moving to Sydney and setting up there with work and living a good life in Sydney. We were looking at apartments where the lease was 6 or 12 months, which I'm so glad we didn't do that, because if we did, we would have been so tied to that apartment. For example, we left Sydney after 4 months. I went and met my girlfriend doing my farm work. If we'd stayed in Sydney tied to an apartment, I would never have met her or done anything like that. And to be honest, as much as I'm glad as my whole Australian journey went as it was because of that, if I could have that time again, I definitely would have travelled first, because like I said, there's so much to see in Australia and so many places which I actually liked more than Sydney. And also it was winter in Sydney, so like, I don't know what we were doing, to be honest, staying there. We should have gone up the east coast or something, so I wish I knew about traveling first. Number 9, I wish I knew that I needed an Australian bank account in order to get paid. I had a Monzo card, which is an international bank card, and that got me by in Australia. I could pay for stuff on that. I then got my first job, and it wasn't until I was just about to start that job when they were like, oh yeah, by the way, you need an Australian bank account to get paid. So I actually had to go and apply for an Australian bank account. And I don't know if this is normal, but it took about at least a week for it to actually come through, my bank card to come through and actually to get sorted, which delayed my start at work by over a week. If I knew about setting up my Australian bank account straight away, I would have been able to start work earlier. So it's definitely worth taking into consideration, because I thought I could get paid into my international card, which usually you can't. And number 10, I wish I knew how hard it would be to make friends. Now, I'm not too fussed about this, it hasn't bothered me much, but I think initially you're kind of chasing meeting people, which I guess is good because it's good to meet new people, but I was kind of thinking, oh, you know, it'd be nice to make some friends, and almost putting pressure on this whole idea of making a new friendship group in Australia. But realistically, after 3 years abroad, I've realised how hard it is to make close friends, and now I just stress so much less about it, If I make friends, great. If I don't really care. Most of my close friends are at home and I've always got them, so I'm not too fussed about making friends abroad. But initially, maybe I did put a bit of pressure on, you know, making friends, but you know, it's harder than it seems. So they are 10 things that I wish I knew before moving to Australia. Like I said, it would have made the time a little bit easier, but I'm glad my whole Australian journey went as it was. But when I go back to Australia, I definitely don't want to make some of these mistakes again. So I hope you found this video helpful. You guys who are moving to Australia, you might be able to get a bit more of an idea of some mistakes that I made and things to consider when moving there. So thank you for watching, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next video.